Bob Dylan challenged Jimi to play acoustic guitar. What happened next changed music forever. Spring 1968, New York City. Jimi Hendrix was at the peak of his fame. Are You Experienced had changed rock music. Purple Haze, Foxy Lady, and The Wind Cries Mary were on every radio station. He was known as the electric guitar god, the man who could make a Stratocaster scream, cry, and speak in tongues. His live performances were legendary, loud, explosive, psychedelic experiences where he'd play with his teeth, behind his head, sometimes setting his guitar on fire. But there were critics. Some music purists, especially in the folk community, dismissed Jimi as all flash and no substance. "He's just loud," they'd say. "Take away the volume and the effects, and what do you have? Turn off the amps, and let's see if he can actually play." Dylan heard these criticisms. Dylan himself had gone electric in 1965 at the Newport Folk Festival and been booed by folk purists who thought he'd betrayed acoustic music. But Dylan could do both. He'd proven himself as an acoustic artist before going electric. He wondered if Jimi could do the same in reverse. Dylan and Jimi had met a few times at music industry parties and events. They respected each other's work, but weren't close friends. Dylan was 7 years older, came from a completely different musical tradition, folk and blues rather than R&B and rock. But both were revolutionaries. Both were changing what popular music could be. One night in May 1968, they ended up at the same party at a brownstone in Greenwich Village. It was a small gathering, maybe 30 people, mostly musicians and producers. The apartment belonged to a music journalist who threw these gatherings regularly, informal salons where artists could meet, talk, argue about music away from the public eye. Allen Ginsberg was there, a couple of members from the band, some jazz musicians whose names everyone knew. The atmosphere was intellectual, artistic, slightly competitive in the way that gatherings of creative people often are.
Someone had an acoustic guitar sitting in the corner, a Martin D28, the classic folk guitar, the instrument of choice for serious acoustic players. It had probably cost $400, a small fortune in 1968. Dylan was holding court, telling stories about his motorcycle accident, drinking wine, being the center of attention, as he often was. He had that quality. When Dylan talked, people listened, even other famous people. Someone brought up Jimi's latest performance at the Fillmore East, where he'd apparently played a 20-minute version of Voodoo Child that included feedback orchestras and sounds nobody had heard a guitar make before. "Electric guitar is easy," Dylan said, loud enough for the room to hear. "Not mean, not aggressive, but provocative. You turn up loud enough, use enough effects, and anyone can sound impressive. The real test is acoustic, just you and the guitar. Nowhere to hide." The room got quiet. Everyone knew Jimi was there. Everyone knew Dylan was essentially calling him out. Jimi didn't respond immediately. He was sitting on a couch in the corner, nursing a drink, watching the dynamics of the room. He wasn't one for confrontation, didn't like making scenes, but he also didn't like being dismissed. "You play acoustic, Bob?" Jimi finally said, his voice quiet but clear. "Been doing it longer than you've been alive," Dylan replied with a slight smile. "That guitar over there work?" Jimi nodded toward the Martin in the corner. "Far as I know. Mind if I borrow it?" The room's energy shifted. People sensed something was about to happen.
Dylan gestured toward the guitar. "Be my guest. Let's hear what the electric guitar god can do when you take away his electricity." Jimi stood up, walked over to the Martin, and picked it up. He sat back down, adjusted the guitar on his lap, and spent a minute tuning it. The room watched in complete silence. Then Jimi started playing. He didn't play one of his own songs. He didn't play a blues standard or a safe crowd pleaser. He played Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. The song had been released just a few months earlier on Dylan's John Wesley Harding album. It was a stark, minimal recording, just Dylan's voice, acoustic guitar, bass, and drums. Dylan considered it one of his best songs, a mysterious, apocalyptic narrative that he'd labored over, rewriting dozens of times. The lyrics were cryptic, biblical, full of symbols that meant everything and nothing. "There must be some way out of here," it began, and it never quite explained what "here" was or what "way out" looked like. Jimi played it on that acoustic guitar, and it was different from anything anyone in that room had heard. He started with the finger-picking pattern, delicate and precise. No pick, just fingers and thumb creating the rhythm and melody simultaneously. His fingers moved across the strings with the same speed and dexterity he used on electric, but now every note was clear, distinct, unamplified. You could hear individual strings vibrating. You could hear the wood of the guitar resonating. There was nowhere to hide behind volume or distortion. This was pure musicianship, naked and exposed. Then he started singing. Jimi rarely sang other people's lyrics exactly. He usually rewrote songs to suit his style. But tonight, he sang Dylan's words exactly as written. His voice softer than on his recordings, more vulnerable, bringing out the menace and mystery in the lyrics. "There must be some way out of here," said the Joker to the thief. The words took on new weight in Jimi's voice, darker, more urgent. As he played, Jimi began adding his own touches, little runs between verses, harmonic flourishes that Dylan's original didn't have. He played rhythm and lead simultaneously, making the acoustic guitar sound like two instruments. His thumb worked the bass notes while his fingers danced on the higher strings, creating a complete arrangement with just 6 strings and 10 fingers. The room was mesmerized. This wasn't loud. This wasn't flashy. This was pure, undeniable musical genius operating at a level most people in that room, all professional musicians themselves, couldn't touch. Every person there played an instrument, many at a very high level. But watching Jimi play acoustic, they understood they were witnessing something beyond technical skill. This was artistry, interpretation, the ability to hear music in 3 dimensions and translate it through wood and steel strings. Allen Ginsberg, the poet, watched with tears in his eyes. He'd later write about that moment, about how Jimi made the guitar sound like a voice from another world, how the music felt religious in its intensity. Dylan sat perfectly still in his chair across the room, watching Jimi's hands, listening to his own song transformed into something richer, deeper, more complex than he'd imagined it could be. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between stunned and grateful, like a painter watching someone complete a canvas he'd started. When Jimi finished, there was a beat of silence, that pause that happens when something profound has just occurred and nobody wants to be the first to break the spell. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly everyone was applauding, not the wild, screaming applause of a rock concert, but the respectful, awed applause of musicians recognizing mastery, the kind of applause that says, "I just witnessed something I'll tell people about for the rest of my life." People were looking at each other, shaking their heads in disbelief, mouthing, "Did you hear that?" Allen Ginsberg stood up and bowed to Jimi, an unexpected gesture of respect from one artist to another. Jimi set the guitar down and looked at Dylan. "That work for you?" Jimi asked. Dylan didn't answer right away. He stood up, walked over to Jimi, and sat down next to him. "Where do you learn to play like that?" Dylan asked quietly. "Same place you did, probably," Jimi replied. "Listening to old blues records, watching fingers, trying to figure out how they made those sounds. I grew up on acoustic. Electric came later. My first guitar was acoustic. Couldn't afford an electric. Taught myself on that thing, playing along with blues records my dad would play. Muddy Waters, Robert Johnson, B.B. King, all acoustic or semi-acoustic back then. I learned every Robert Johnson song I could find, learned how he made one guitar sound like a full band. That was my foundation. Electric guitar was just amplifying what I already knew how to do. Dylan nodded slowly, processing this. I owe you an apology. I dismissed you as flash without substance. I thought the volume and the fire and the theatrics were compensation for lack of real musicianship. I was wrong. I was very wrong. You aren't completely wrong, Jimi said generously. I do love the flash, the volume, the effects, the theatrics. That's part of who I am. But it's not all of who I am. Just like going electric wasn't betraying your folk roots, it was adding to them. You didn't lose your acoustic skills when you plugged in, you just added volume to your truth. Dylan nodded slowly, processing this. Can I ask you something? Sure. That arrangement you just played of Watchtower, have you been working on that?
Never played it before tonight, Jimi said. I heard your version when it came out. Loved the song. Just now I was figuring it out as I went. Dylan looked stunned. You improvised that whole arrangement on the spot? More or less. I heard how you did it, heard how I might do it differently. Let my fingers find the spaces. Dylan sat back. You should record it. Your song, Jimi said, wouldn't be right. No, Dylan said firmly. You should record it. That's not my song anymore. That's your song. What you just played, that's the definitive version. I want to hear you do that with your band, with your sound. Take it. Make it yours. You sure? I've never been more sure of anything. That's how that song is supposed to sound. I just didn't know it until you played it. 3 months later, in September 1968, Jimi recorded All Along the Watchtower with the Jimi Hendrix Experience at Olympic Studios in London. He took the acoustic arrangement he'd improvised at that Greenwich Village party and translated it to electric guitar, adding his signature wah-wah effects, his sustain, his power. But the structure, the way he played rhythm and lead simultaneously, the harmonic flourishes, the urgency in his voice, that all came from that acoustic performance for Dylan. The recording session was intense. Jimi spent hours getting the guitar tone exactly right, layering multiple guitar tracks, building the song into something that sounded both ancient and futuristic. Dave Mason from Traffic played acoustic guitar on the track. The Experience's drummer Mitch Mitchell played one of his best drum performances of his career, driving and propulsive. The bass line, played by Noel Redding, was simple but perfect. When the song was released in September 1968 as a single, it became one of Jimi's biggest hits, reaching number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, higher than most of his original songs ever charted. Radio stations that had been reluctant to play Jimi's music because it was too wild or too black played Watchtower constantly because it was a Dylan song, which gave it legitimacy in their eyes. Dylan heard the recording and loved it. In interviews afterward, he said, I liked Jimi Hendrix's record of All Along the Watchtower. I've never been so honored by someone covering a song of mine. It overwhelmed me, really. He had such talent. He could find things inside a song and vigorously develop them. He found things that other people wouldn't think of finding in there. He probably improved upon it by the spaces he was using. I took license with the song from his version, actually, and continue to do it to this day. That last part is crucial. Dylan started performing All Along the Watchtower in Jimi's arrangement, not his own. The songwriter adopted the cover artist's version of his own song. That's how good Jimi's interpretation was. But the real story wasn't the hit record. The real story was that night in Greenwich Village when Bob Dylan challenged Jimi Hendrix to prove himself on acoustic guitar, and Jimi responded by showing Dylan what his own song could be. Dylan had been testing Jimi, trying to separate flash from substance, spectacle from musicianship. Instead, Jimi had shown him that electric fireworks and acoustic mastery weren't opposites,
They were different expressions of the same deep musical understanding. Years later, after Jimi's death in 1970, Dylan was asked about that night in Greenwich Village during an interview for Rolling Stone magazine.
"Did you really challenge him?" the interviewer asked.
"I was being provocative," Dylan admitted, his voice quiet and reflective. "Maybe a bit of an asshole, honestly. I was tired of hearing critics compare us, saying I was serious music and he was entertainment. I wanted to see if he could do what I did, strip it down to just guitar and voice, strip away all the Marshall stacks and the volume and the effects and see what was left." "And what did you learn?" "I learned that Jimi Hendrix could probably play any style of music he wanted to play. He could have been a jazz guitarist, a classical guitarist, a blues guitarist, a folk guitarist, whatever he chose. But he chose to be Jimi Hendrix, which meant all of that and more, filtered through his own unique vision. The flash and volume weren't hiding anything, they were revealing what he had to say. I was looking at it wrong, asking the wrong questions." "Do you regret challenging him that night?" Dylan shook his head slowly, a slight smile crossing his face. "No, because it led to him recording Watchtower, and that's one of the greatest recordings in rock history, and it taught me not to assume I understand an artist's depth by their surface presentation. Jimi taught me that lesson in about 3 minutes with an acoustic guitar in a living room." The story of that night became legendary in music circles. People who were there told it for years, how Bob Dylan challenged Jimi Hendrix, how Jimi picked up an acoustic guitar and played Dylan's own song better than Dylan had, how Dylan gave the song away right there in that living room.
It's a story about respect, about assumptions, about the difference between style and substance. Dylan assumed Jimi was all style. Jimi proved that style and substance aren't mutually exclusive. They're different ways of expressing the same artistic truth. Bob Dylan challenged Jimi to play acoustic guitar. What happened next was Jimi playing Dylan's songs so beautifully, so completely, so perfectly, that Dylan gave it to him forever. And that changed how people understood both artists. Dylan wasn't just a folk purist who went electric. He was an artist who could recognize greatness even when it came dressed in psychedelic clothes and played through Marshall stacks. And Jimi wasn't just a flashy showman with loud guitars. He was a complete musician who could play anything, anywhere, with anything, but chose to play loud because that's how his truth sounded. If this story of mutual respect and artistic recognition moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that mastery can wear many faces. Have you ever been underestimated based on your style? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more untold stories of legends recognizing legends.